This year marks the 91st anniversary of the armistice that ended the First World War. Most of the people who fought in that war have now passed on. All we're left with are the thousands of white crosses marking their graves in Flanders and elsewhere. Their poems, their diaries, their memories, the aging photographs, paintings, histories, and stories, all a mute legacy to a cataclysmic paroxysm in history. As already heard, New Zealand mobilized and dispatched 110,000 men and women to that war. 18,000 New Zealanders were killed, 55,000 were wounded, 73,000 casualties in all, or 66% of those who were sent to the front. Almost every family in New Zealand was touched directly or indirectly by someone who was killed or wounded. And those who returned were the walking wounded. Some were mentally and physically traumatized. All were scarred for life. The experience etched on their memories forever. The First World War was one of appalling slaughter. From all around the world, 65 million men and women were mobilized, 8.5 million were killed, 21 million were wounded. When my wife and I visited the Rampart Cemetery, not far from near Ypres, a few years ago, it's a small cemetery in the town next door, not far from what was known as Sniper Alley, we stood in silence before the graves of 3 Maori soldiers, aged 18, 21, and 23. They came from places like Gisborne, Te Arara, and Whakatane. We wondered what on earth had brought them there, and what did they think about? And what did they think about when they got there? We could imagine how they set off as warriors to fight in foreign places, but what did they feel when the reality of war set in? When they were ordered to march up the alley? What do they think about home there, away from their family, their hapu and the iwi? What do they think about their cause? Were they fighting for God, king, and country? Or were they simply trapped in an imperial adventure over which they had absolutely no control? These kids had barely emerged from adolescence, and their short lives were terminated, along with those of thousands of others, as they were ordered up the alley to front lines. Most who started up that road in Ypres never made it to the end. So why are we commemorating and remembering the First World War 91 years on? And I've got sort of 5 different reasons. First of all, many of us are baby boomers linked to that moment in history. My father, for example, was born in 1914 and my mother in 1918. They spanned the cataclysm. Its consequences affected their perceptions as they tried to make sense of the turbulent years of the 1920s and 30s, and as they confronted the challenges posed by fascism in the Second World War. So we who are left have got to make sense of their experiences and their memories and histories because they layer themselves on us. Second, it was a war of unimaginable misery and carnage. The fact that human beings emerged from that carnage with some measure of dignity intact is a testimony to the power of the human spirit in the face of appalling adversity. We who are alive now need to learn from these experiences so that we understand something of the capacity of individuals to protect their humanity in the face of powerful dehumanizing forces. We need to understand this carnage as a way of learning how people deal with the imminent threat of death and destruction and manage to survive with their dignity. Thirdly, it was an example of what we now know as total war, fought with modern technology with devastating consequences. It gave us the Vickers machine gun, tanks, poison gas, warplanes, and other weapons of mass destruction. It obliterated the distinctions between civilian and soldiers and the doctrines that went with this distinction. Fourth, those who returned from that war to New Zealand, people like John A. Lee or Ormond Burton, who we've already heard about, people who distinguished themselves in the battlefield, were appalled at the huge gap between political rhetoric and the soldiers' realities. This wasn't a glorious war. It was a messy, bloody, and in the end, unnecessary war, serving very particular interests at very particular moments in time. The First World War placed a question mark over all wars as a means of settling disputes, and yet 21 years later, the world was embroiled in another one. So the world didn't learn. It wasn't the war to end all wars. It was a precursor to even more sophisticated slaughter. It's salutary to remind ourselves of the hopes that emerged from the First World War, why they were dashed, in order to do something about what that might tell us about dealing with conflict in the future. Fifthly, the military men and women who fought in that war and all wars since understand better than most something of the challenges that war poses to them as individual human beings and as war challenges to them as professional soldiers. That's why serving military, and I'm pleased to see so many here, are often much more prudent and less jingoistic than their political leaders when it comes to understanding something of the hazards of war, something of the hazards of violent conflict and of coercive diplomacy and of dispatching men and women to their death in pursuit of political interests. We have to be very sure and very humble that the cause to which we're dispatching those women is a just one, and not a kind of and one which for which there are no other alternatives. Wars of choice are extraordinarily dangerous wars, as we've discovered in Iraq and elsewhere. Finally, the Second World War, the First World War, the Second World War, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the ongoing wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, all stand in a relatively uninterrupted line of 20th and 21st century violence. If this century is to be the age of maturity, it's vital that we learn from the mistakes of the past so that we're not doomed to repeat them in the future. So irrespective of what we think about the merits of these wars, we must respect the memories of those who fought in them and survived, and I salute all of those who did. Both of us, both people who served in both wars and all wars since have got much to teach us about life, death, survival, and the retention of humanity. I'd also like to take advantage of this moment to honor those who did not fight, those who consciously objected to war. That act, which was so often misunderstood at the time, also required a certain kind of courage, namely the courage to say no to the state and to public opinion in a time of national crisis. The actions of those who said no added to our freedom by creating a space for dissent, which is also essential to a flourishing democracy. So I want to honor both the warriors and the pacifists. We need them both, as the reading from Ecclesiastes reminded us. There are seasons for war and peace, for healing and for sowing. And the New Testament reading raises the bar a bit more and reminds us of the imperative for Christians to be peacemakers. Both perspectives, the warrior and the pacifist perspective, are absolutely vital for a balanced understanding of the complexities of war. And my own family embodied these tensions. My uncle, Owen Gatman, enlisted in the war in the very first echelon before conscription. So Private Owen Gatman, as he was, chose to fight in that war and was killed at Sidi Aziz in Libya. His letters have been published in a book entitled On Active Service. And if you want to read it, there are lots of lovely letters in it. I'm going to quote from a few of them. In 1940, for example, he was much cheered by the King's Empire broadcast, in which the King said, quote, "Keep your hearts proud and your resolve unshaken. Let's go forward to that task as one man, a smile on your lips and our heads held high. With God's help, we shall not fail." Stirring message from our side of the lines. But Germans were also dispatched to the front lines with somewhat similar sentiments echoing in their minds as well. My father, on the other hand, chose to be one of those who conscientiously objected to war and spent the duration in detention. As the war progressed and he became aware of the specific evils of fascism, he was constantly plagued by anxiety about whether his decision was the right one. In the end, he decided that his stand did generate a creative tension between the non-violent and violent options, but he always felt conflicted. Uncle Owen wrote on April 11th, 1941, from Egypt. "I truly hope," he said, "that Les Clements, my father, will change his views about pacifism. What he sees in his glorious stand doesn't work very well here at the present time." Oh, sorry, that was written from Greece, just before he was evacuated to Crete. And you can see in these exchanges that there was a deep tension, and still is, between those who wish to pursue peace through force or peace through friendly persuasion. These are truly cosmic questions. What's the best path to peace is something that has engaged men and women of goodwill from all the major faiths for millennia. Indeed, the whole Bible is to some extent one long record of violence and how Jews and Christians have grappled with that violence. Yahweh, for example, the God of the Hebrew tribes, was viewed as a warrior. All of the prophets and religious teachers, however, acknowledged that they couldn't live in a state of war and were equally concerned with how to generate the conditions for a just and peaceful society. They were overwhelmed with the dehumanizing and evil effects of war and could see how it divided and brutalized people. Then along came Jesus, who said, "Well, peace be with you. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, love your enemies, do good to those who wish you ill, and don't be overcome by evil. Defeat it with goodness." So you have two contradictory impulses that lie at the heart of the Abrahamic faith, the warrior and the pacifist traditions. Even Jesus said, I've come not to bring peace but a sword, to bring division into families, right into the heart of the people of Israel. And what all those people are reflecting is that search for truth, for righteousness, for justice and peace, or what we might call the kingdom of heaven. It's going to be divisive. It will generate conflict. And the challenge is, how do we deal with that conflict? How do we deal with it creatively and non-violently, and in ways which will ensure that progress will occur rather than kind of destruction? And that's the kind of issue that we're grappling with in the new centre, which has come into existence at the University of Otago. So how do we balance the demands of church and state, Caesar and Jesus, peace and justice? When the Roman Emperor Constantine became a Christian, there was a fusion of church and state, which meant the defense of the state was also a defense of Christianity and vice versa. Now there's much more likely to be a division between the church and the state, and I think that's how it should be. There needs to be a tension between the claims of both. Given weapons of mass destruction, we can no longer claim that the interests of communities of faith are served by the interests of the state and the military. So we've got to adopt a much more critical stance. So our challenge as Christians, as human beings, as members of human communities, is to work out how to prevent such violence in the future. We need the support of all faith communities in order to do that. And we've got to have what my father called love, courage, and hope. And they were the qualities that enabled those of you who've served in war to come back intact. They were the qualities that enabled individuals to survive the carnage of the First World War. It's the power of love, kindness, humility, and compassion that enables us to maintain our humanity, our integrity, our wholeness, and our aliveness. That's what enabled us to live meaningful lives in the face of almost certain death. My Uncle Owen's letters, for example, were all about friends, families, lovers, community, and the memory of bitter times. They're about the boredom of war and its nerve-breaking tensions. To my great-aunt Alice, just after the horrors of Crete, he wrote, quote, "Stories of hopeless and desperate soldiers lying side by side with the hellish enemy, breathing the last hours away. The sin of it all. Never again do I want to fight under such conditions. What a terrible tragedy this beast of Berlin has cast on his people and ours. What a lot he'll have to account for before his maker." What a golden thread of courageous faith is this for us, who recognize our ability to see beautiful things amidst the trials of battle. The beauty of sunset and dawn made one by nature. Bombs, shells, poison gas cannot and will not wreck our faith in human nature or our love for this everlasting right. We know that whatever sorrows have darkened this world, beauty still remains. This was just after he had been kind of evacuated from Crete. "Dear one," he says, "be hopeful. Life won't be in vain. After the storms of winter, roses will bloom again. I'm supremely thankful that in the kindness of loved ones, even if we are separated for a while, we can find rest and security." So we remember on this Remembrance Day so that we can find that deepest source of love, life, security, and fearlessness. This source doesn't flow from powers and principalities or from the most sophisticated bombers, missiles, and submarines. Rather, it comes from that deep affirmation of all that binds us together as human beings. It flows from that enhancement of our capacity to take delight in the beauty that exists all around us and in the creative responses we make to that beauty. It requires an ability to see ourselves in webs of relationships and in communities that sustain and nurture our ability to be fully alive and fully human. It requires courage and an acceptance of the risks in peace building. 2 weeks before my uncle was killed, he wrote, after 3 days of desert battle, when he'd been, he said, "It's now that I often think of home and wonder what everybody is doing, for I feel you're very near and dear to me. I appreciate the lifelike pictures that are painted for me within the pages sent so regularly. I can see in my mind's eye all the beauty and splendor of blossoms, flowers, roses. They bloom again within my central being, and the dullness and the loneliness of this wild desert waste disappears from my view. I'm uplifted to greater and nobler hopes and desires of things that will emerge out of this chaos. I look forward to my return home with a wild longing. Lots of love, Owen. Kiss, kiss, kiss." In the face of this sentiment, we who remember have a responsibility to assure to ensure that never again will there be such chaos. We have to learn better ways of building peace. We have to celebrate life as though we are all to die tomorrow. We have to learn forgiveness and compassion. And most of all, we need to acknowledge that our capacity to be who we are rests in the quality of our relationships with others. It rests in our capacity to forgive those who we've been fighting with, to embrace them now as fellow human beings, Japanese, Turks, Germans, all those who were dehumanized and demonized. And there's a lovely poem by Alistair Campbell called Journey from Despair, and it works well, I think, with the sentiments of Remembrance Day. He says, forgiveness is a journey I must take, alone into my childish fears, and there confront my fathers for my children's sake. I must go before I cease to care, and the world darkens and I cannot move. Forgiveness is a journey from despair, along a path my ancestors approve. I must go back and with them make my peace. Forgiveness is a journey into love.
In Flanders fields, the poppies grow. Between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky, the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago, we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders.